Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to our Markou seminar series today. It's really a pleasure to introduce Eric Stice to you. Eric and I trained at the same graduate program at Arizona State University. As you can see from his title slide, he's gone on to great achievements in grants and is very successful eating disorders researcher at Oregon Research Institute. What I think is really impressive about Eric's program of research is how wide-ranging it is. So he does research not only in basic science, but also treatment and also prevention. He does research both in eating disorders and in obesity. He does research with lots of different age groups, lots of college campus programs, and uses techniques ranging from cognitive training to fMRI to genetics. So really quite an expert in this area. It's a real pleasure to have you here, Eric, so thank you so much for coming. We're looking forward to your talk. Oh, and I'm supposed to say for the folks who might be watching, if you have a question, use the raise your hand on the computer.
Just for people in here, if you could raise your hand.
And for people in here.
We'll bring a microphone to you.
Raise your hand, okay.
All right, well, thank you very much, both. Thanks everybody for coming to this presentation. I know it's a beautiful day outside and you don't really need to be inside, but happy to have you here. So today I was going to talk about something totally different than what I talked about when I visited Walt's group in the fall this year. So if you were there, which I see some faces that are familiar, there will be no repetition, or there should be no repetition. But I wanted to sort of cover a little bit about how we've used risk factor work to kind of inform the development of prevention programs that have been pretty efficacious for eating disorders, but then also kind of talk about kind of our newer program of research, which is trying to tackle obesity, again, kind of really using good prospective studies to kind of inform that. And all this research is supported by NIH. So I was going to first describe the evidence base for the BODY project, which is a cognitive dissonance-based eating disorder prevention program. And it's resulted in the risk factor work that we've done, and it's a good kind of example of translational work from risk factor kind of basic etiology work to intervention. Then I'll review some neuro risk factor work that we've done with regard to predictors of weight gain, and touch on some dopaminergic research, research on genes related that we think related to dopaminergic functioning that seem to predict weight gain pretty reliably, and then present results from response and attention training trial that reduces risk factors. So does this sound familiar? Was this different than what I talked about last time? Okay, good. Yeah, I think we talked about the treatment and the BODY project a little bit. So eating disorders affect about 13% of the population, of young women that is, a little bit lower percentage for males. They're marked by distress, impairment, functional difficulties interpersonally, et cetera, and elevated morbidity. In fact, I think eating disorders are credited as the most lethal psychiatric disorder in terms of mortality. Yet about 80% of people with eating disorders never receive treatment. And this prompted us to think it would be very valuable to develop effective prevention programs. And from just a humanitarian perspective, I really like the idea of helping people not develop problems rather than treating them after they develop problems. But of course, they're both very important. We thought that a better understanding of risk factor research would help us inform better design of prevention programs. And I should say, back when we got into this, which was back actually even before you started graduate school, Beth, we had sort of started doing some of the prospective studies, and there was no eating disorder prevention programs that produced any effects at all in terms of eating disorder symptoms or future eating disorder onset. So it was a pretty glum situation. In fact, I had understood that NIH said no more grants for eating disorder prevention because the last one we paid for was such an abysmal failure. And so it was a very kind of strange time. So anyway, we had conducted a bunch of prospective studies. Some of these were published subsequently to when we started the prevention work, but they tell a pretty consistent story, that pressure to be thin, pursuit of the thin beauty ideal, body dissatisfaction, dieting, and negative affect are pretty reliable predictors of future onset of eating disorders and symptoms. And I should underscore the eating disorder part, although the pointer doesn't work, so I won't do that with this. That just up until very recently, there have not been any prospective studies that were adequately powered to allow you to predict onset of anorexia nervosa, separate from bulimia nervosa, separate from binge eating disorder, and separate from purging disorder. And we've been trying to do some high-risk prospective studies, and we actually can predict onset of those disorders separately now, and they also line up with these. But in the early days, all they did was predict future symptom gain, and that doesn't necessarily translate into eating disorders per se. So these findings have generally replicated well across studies conducted by a whole bunch of research teams in a whole bunch of different countries. And it is important to note that these risk factors don't just predict eating disorder onset in America, but also in a lot of other countries that are Western and non-Western as well. This led us to propose this. Actually, this is what I proposed when I was in graduate school, but it's an etiologic model that tried to articulate how these risk factors could work together to culminate in increased risk for binge, purge spectrum eating disorders. And what we essentially proposed was pressure to be thin and internalization or pursuit of the thin beauty ideal results in body dissatisfaction. This body dissatisfaction in turn increases risk for unhealthy dieting, and every hour that you go without eating, the reward value of food goes up, so that's usually bound to fail eventually. And body dissatisfaction also contributes to negative affect, and dieting and negative affect are the two final pathways to eating disorder onset. I have to say that we just figured out the strategy of, we talk about these multivariate etiologic models, but we finally figured out a strategy to look at the temporal sequencing of the emergence of these risk factors, and we're just writing up the paper, was working on it this morning, but in a nutshell, you can conduct ROC, receiver operator characteristic analyses, to identify the best level of each of these risk factors that predicts future onset of any eating disorder, balancing sensitivity and specificity, and you get these cut points, and you can take and do latent growth curve models and fit individual slopes and intercepts for every subject and figure out precisely when people showed emergence of this versus that. And I was really happy that about half of the people who showed onset of any of the eating disorders other than anorexia nervosa, because there's different risk factors for that, it actually occurred in this order for half the sample. And the other half of the sample, they were kind of close to the mark. So it's kind of a cool way, if you're curious about when risk factors first emerge, and this is germane because if you want to do prevention programs, it makes sense to turn down the earliest risk factor and to do so at the best time. So anyway, it's kind of exciting when we published this paper in 1994 and finally had an ability to test a temporal sequencing applied this year, and it actually worked out fairly well. So, but I don't have a slide for that yet. So anyway, we decided to use cognitive dissonance to try to prevent eating disorders, and this is because the first generation of eating disorder prevention programs were educational and just basically said, these are eating disorders, they're bad, you shouldn't have them. Big surprise, didn't work at all, didn't work in the substance abuse field, didn't work in eating disorders. But we thought we'd try something different with dissonance induction. This was I was treating an anorexia nervosa patient at Stanford, and I'd spent days and days trying to convince her out of having anorexia nervosa, and I finally was just like totally fed up and at a loss. So she showed up for 5th or 6th session, and I just said, today we're going to switch roles, and you're going to talk me out of having an eating disorder. And it was really awesome. You could just really see her. It was really, really hard for her to argue against herself because I'd parrot back the arguments that she had given to me. And it seemed to really produce good attitudinal change. So we decided to try to pour that into a prevention program. And it's this, the cognitive dissonance is something I'm sure we've all learned about if you've had any psychology classes. But basically, Fessinger proposed that we have a fundamental desire to maintain consistency between what we say and what we do. So what we do is have people act like they're healthy or say things that are healthy, and their attitudes follow suit. So it's a persuasion principle, but it's a very simple principle. But in a nutshell, in the Body Project, the young women who are in the intervention go through a series of verbal, written, and behavioral exercises where they basically just examine the cost of pursuing the thin beauty ideal, like using Socratic questions and role plays and all that. It reduces thin ideal internalization because people adjust their attitudes to fit with their publicly displayed behavior. And that reduction in thin ideal internalization should theoretically reduce body dissatisfaction, dieting, negative affect, and eating pathology. So we did a couple pilot trials with this intervention, trying to kind of shake it out, design it, and improve the script. And in 2006, we published the first larger efficacy trial. And in that study, we compared the Body Project dissonance-based intervention to the Healthy Weight. It's an obesity kind of / eating disorder prevention program that's really just about making small, minor adjustments to dietary intake and exercise to bring energy balance, or energy intake into balance with output, an expressive riding control condition, and an assessment-only control condition. The long and short story is we got nice reductions in eating disorder symptoms relative initially to all three of the comparison conditions. And over time, the effects, of course, attenuate, but showed some persistence over time, even out to 2 and 3 year follow-up. We are still seeing some reductions in risk factors and some symptoms. And this is pretty good because in this trial, the interventions were 3 hours long. So to be able to detect any signal 3 hours or 3 years after a 3-hour intervention, we were quite excited. In fact, they asked NIMH for money to do these analyses, and they're like, no, you'll never get effects out to 3 year follow-up, and totally refused to fund it. And luckily, we did get some effects. And that's now replicated in other trials. But the most important thing is actually we saw about a 60% reduction in future eating disorder onset. So if you look at any DSM-4 eating disorder at that point in time, there was 60% fewer cases in the dissonance condition versus the assessment-only control condition, with a healthy weight and the expressive riding kind of falling in between. So this was the first for an eating disorder prevention program. It's actually very hard to get prevention of future onset of any psychopathology in prevention. In depression, they seem to do it fairly well, but with eating disorders, it's been pretty hard. So I did want to talk a little bit more about this before I transition into the fMRI work. But I just wanted to, Neelu and I were talking a little bit about evidence-based programs, and I was submitting that I think we need to have higher standards for evidence-based. When we say something's evidence-based treatment, I think people mean an enormous range of things. And in my perspective, I think beating out a credible alternative control condition, replicating the effects in efficacy and effectiveness trials, I think we can have higher standards. So, we've gotten good effects in efficacy trials, replicates in a whole bunch of different labs. We actually just submitted a meta-analysis a couple months ago that had 42 different trials in it that nearly all of them find effects for the Body Project or other dissonance-based eating disorder prevention programs. And those that don't tell us a whole lot about how not to do prevention. So it was a very educational meta-analysis, but the results seem pretty reliable. And it's beaten out 6 credible alternative interventions, which from my perspective is absolutely critical. If we can't beat out credible alternative interventions, we're not really showing our intervention works. We're showing that when people do a whole bunch of work to address a problem, they report reductions in it, which could be totally demand characteristics or expectancies. So I personally think we need to have higher standards and have active, credible alternative interventions as comparison conditions for our trials, because it really, I think if you can show your intervention beats out other credible things, the uptake and dissemination is much higher. So we also spent a lot of time conducting kind of nerdy scientific studies. I think this is valuable because testing various facets of the intervention theory is important for really kind of developing a compelling evidence base for an intervention. So we first conducted a test of the mediator that theoretically accounts for the Body Project effects, and that would be a reduction in thin ideal internalization. We did find basically that the Body Project participants showed greater reductions in eating disorder symptoms. Also, the other outcomes that are downstream according to that dual pathway model, such as body dissatisfaction, dieting, and negative affect, and eating disorder symptoms, of course. And we even we used another sort of temporal sequencing approach to confirm that the reductions in the mediator occurred before the reduction in the outcome for more of the subjects than you'd expect based on chance. It's a bit of a mouthful, but people talk about mediation without paying any attention to time, and I sort of find it weird because it seems like you should have time in a mediational model if a variable A is supposed to cause change in a variable B, that you'd want A to go down before B. Anyway, it worked out for the Body Project. Melinda Green did a really cool study that I was very excited to see, but she basically did, I think that the most stringent comparison condition you can do, that she took and created a low dissonance and a high dissonance version of the Body Project. Now, cognitive dissonance being from social psychology, there's like dozens and dozens of experiments have been published over the years, but what those have taught us is that there's 4 factors that you need to turn up to maximize dissonance induction. So she turned all those up in a high dissonance condition and turned them all down in a low dissonance condition. So for example, if you underscore the voluntary nature of being in the group and participating, make homework optional, it actually creates more dissonance. If you tell people, well, you don't have to do the home exercises, you wouldn't really think that that's the best way to improve your effects, but ironically it does with dissonance interventions. We also did things like increasing public accountability by putting a video camera in the room. Who would have thought that just putting a video camera in the corner of the room would create, increase your effects? That particular manipulation was totally supported in our meta-analysis, so I really think it's quite important. But anyway, she also made more exercises more effortful, so she basically took all the home exercises and made them twice as hard, which you would think, who would want that? But it produced bigger effects. We were able to replicate that in an independent study with a poor undergraduate who signed up for an honors project with us. But it's really, in both studies, the high dissonance intervention produced significantly larger reductions in eating disorder symptoms than the low dissonance intervention. And it's just the same content. So in the control condition, they heard the same stuff that was discussed in the high dissonance body project. So I would submit there's a very rigorous test of the intervention theory, but this is the kind of stuff we need to do to really generate programs and interventions that are really effective. We're also interested in testing the question of whether, when you implement a prevention program in high school settings and college settings, can you interrupt the etiologic process that gives rise to the eating disorder or the disorder of interest? So we did classification tree analysis, which is basically ROC on, a recursive version of ROC, but it's basically an algorithm that identifies a baseline predictor that shows the best ability to predict outcome of a dichotomous outcome and tells you the exact cut point. And this is what we did to determine the timing part that I was blathering about earlier. But what we did in this is we were able to find out in this particular data set, which is that study was first published in 2006, that we found that in that sample, the risk factor that best predicted future onset of any eating disorder was denying the cost of pursuing the thin ideal. And sorry, that's such a mouthful, but that's a variable at 1. That had an odds ratio of 5. So if you were above that cut point, you had a 5-fold increased risk for onset of eating disorders over the next 3 years. And what we found was essentially, so the first cut is that first distinction, and you go from about a 6% onset to about a 24% onset of eating disorders over 3-year follow-up. But if you go through the body project labeled dissonance here, you didn't have any onset of eating disorders compared to 50% in the control condition. So it really did seem to interrupt the effect of that particular risk factor. That was probably well suited to the body project because it focuses on the thin ideal. But it was, I think, a good test of whether your prevention program interrupts the processes that you hope it does. And finally, we also used fMRI to try to capture the effect of the intervention. We exposed women to thin models and average weight women before and after the body project. And basically, the participants who went through the body project, well, I should say, to describe this well, at baseline, the people, when they saw a supermodel versus an average weight person like us, they showed much greater activation of the caudate and other reward circuitry when they saw thin women versus average weight women. After the intervention, it was reversed. And that was pretty crazy, but you can see basically before the intervention, they showed greater activation to thin models, and that went down, and very deactivation to average weight women. And then after the intervention, that was really, they basically showed the same degree of reward region circuitry in response to thin and average weight women. So this suggests, I think, in English that the body project alters how your brain is perceiving the thin beauty ideal that's, all over our community, that putatively contributes to eating disorders. So it's nice biological evidence that it works because it's supposed to, or how we theorize it's supposed to work. And I think it's one of the first studies that found evidence using fMRI that this prevention program affects, biological outcome. And I think that's another important thing, because if we want to sort of be sure that we're not just detecting demand characteristics and expectancy effects in our trials, if we use biological outcomes, we can have greater confidence we're actually changing something and seeing objective effects. Just to wrap up this, the Body Project has reduced risk factors and eating disorder symptoms in effectiveness trials in the real world. I didn't want to bore you too much with this, but it works in the real world. And this is culminated in Dove, Unilever implementing the Body Project, a variant of it, in 139 countries so far to over 4 million girls. And it's currently implemented in well over 100 universities in the US. So it seems like it's getting out there and being used. I think one of the secrets of having that success in terms of dissemination is to not charge anything for it and just give it away, which is not going to make you rich, but it seems like it gets programs out there. Okay, so now we're going to shift into obesity. Obesity obviously claims a lot of lives, 2.8 million yearly across the globe. Unfortunately, obesity treatments really don't work horribly well. They're really great at getting people to lose weight. In fact, it's quite easy to get people to lose 10% of the weight, but almost nobody keeps that weight off. And that's because there's compensatory responses. Your metabolism slows, you get better at storing fat efficiently. It paradoxically increases the reward value of high food, so a piece of cake looks better after you've been through a diet or a negative energy balance obesity treatment, and unfortunately that doesn't result in sustained weight loss. So we thought an improved knowledge of the neurovulnerability factors that predict weight gain would help us design better treatment interventions. So high-calorie food intake activates reward circuitry like the midbrain striatum and the orbital cortex, also causes dopamine signaling in these reward regions. There's been a whole bunch of really great animal studies on these topics. We can't do all these with humans, but certainly they're telling a very compelling story. This is what brain regions are activated when you have chocolate milkshake in the scanner compared to tasteless solution, which is sort of an iconic cocktail that's mimicking saliva. But you can just see really nice outlines of the striatum and the orbitofrontal cortex and the gustatory region. So it has a powerful effect. I mean, that's an awful lot of the regions of your brain being activated just by tasting chocolate milkshake. So anticipated tastes of high-calorie foods as well as images of high-calorie foods likewise activate reward circuitry. And all these same events, anticipated receipt, and images of high-calorie foods also activate visual circuitry, gustatory, somatosensory, inhibitory, and motor control regions. That motor control bit is germane to what we'll talk about in a little bit, but it has very broad-ranging effects in terms of our neural circuitry. In terms of governing kind of theories that are alive and well in this literature, the reward circuit is one of my favorite, and basically it posits that people who show greater reward region activation in response to eating palatable food should eat more. And this is sort of one of those, no-brainers. My grandmother would have predicted this. And then there's the incentive sensitization theory, which is a little bit more nuanced, but it basically holds that if you begin a career of overeating, the cues that are associated with the hedonic reward from food intake come to activate your reward circuitry. So when you first eat at McDonald's and have French fries and a chocolate milkshake, the brain reward circuitry is activated in response to eating those foods. But after a couple months of doing that, just seeing the golden arches or a truck, the McDonald's truck drive by you on I-5, is going to activate that reward circuitry and make you crave and desire those foods, leading you to eat when you're not actually hungry. We've sort of weaved these together in a working etiologic model referred to as a dynamic vulnerability model that essentially captures those two things. That we think that if you're at risk for obesity, you're originally born showing elevated reward region responsivity to food intake, and that prompts escalated intake of those foods, which results in hyperresponsivity to cues associated with hedonic reward from those foods. And you show greater and greater activation, reward and attention circuitry when you see these cues. But ironically, it's associated with hyperresponsivity to taste of these foods. So the more you overeat these foods, the more you eat ice cream, the less eating ice cream actually activates your reward circuitry. That sort of combination of effects, we'll talk about this a little bit, but it seems like it's a reasonable working model in terms of these etiologic processes. I do think it's critical to distinguish between reward region response to taste of palatable foods versus palatable food cues. We know from animal studies that basically DA signaling occurs when you first taste, an M&M or whatever it is that they use with these animals, but after repeated conditioning, eating the M&M no longer activates the reward circuitry, but seeing the cue that predicts that you might get the M&M does. So again, we're totally victims of these kind of reward predictive cues, and I think it's probably the primary driver of obesity right now in America. So in terms of correlational data, and I'm sorry if I give correlational data a bad rap, but I just think we need to do prospective and experimental work. But in the early days, they started with a whole bunch of correlational studies, and what the literature found very broadly was that obese versus lean humans showed greater reward region response to food images and less reward region response to food taste. So when we first found this in our first fMRI study, we were like, oh man, this fMRI stuff is a bunch of garbage. It's like telling completely opposite effects, but it was a valid signal, and it's been replicated by a lot of independent labs. But the problem is that there's no way to differentiate an initial vulnerability factor from a consequence of overeating with cross-sectional data. We need high-risk studies, prospective studies, repeated measure studies, and randomized experiments to permit stronger inferences, which I think is a very valuable direction to go, because you can get temporal precedence and hopefully some causal effects there. So we started this by doing, we've done 2 high-risk studies so far, and the high-risk studies are totally common in the field of psychiatry. They're grossly underutilized in the field of obesity. I don't quite understand that, but basically what we did is we took healthy weight teenage kids with 2 obese or overweight parents or 2 lean healthy weight parents and just put them through all these fMRI paradigms at baseline to see if we could detect a signature of a neurovulnerability factor before it's expressed itself in accumulation of body fat. And what we found was healthy weight teens at risk for obesity show much greater responsivity of reward regions to high-calorie food receipt as well as monetary reward. And we, luckily, a smart reviewer said, oh, you should measure responsivity to other types of reward other than just food. So we were able to pick up elevated reward region response to monetary reward as well as taste of chocolate milkshake. So there's no differences, and this actually lines up very well with the incentive sensitization model. There's no differences between high and low risk kids in terms of response to pictures of foods. So if they haven't had a career of overeating, those cues have no predictive power yet. We actually just recently published a study that replicated these findings with a much larger sample, but basically pretty much just the same results occurred in the sense that they showed greater reward in gustatory and oral somatosensory region response to high-calorie food taste, but not the palatable food images. So the palatable food images were not affecting them, which lines up with that dynamic vulnerability model. So another design that's useful is to do prospective studies, and I'm sure everybody here knows what those look like, but you want to test whether a baseline assessed risk factor predicts future onset of a problem or growth in an outcome in which your subjects don't have it at baseline. It's nicely established as temporal precedence, particularly if participants are in a healthy weight range. And why that's important is because if you recruit a 14-year-old and they've actually been overeating for a couple of years, they could have already derailed the reward circuitry or some other, created some other neuroplasticity. So we wanted to make sure we were getting in on the ground floor with our etiologic models. So in our first study, we found that greater OFC, orbital frontal cortex activation in response to cues that just predict presentation of palatable food images predicted future weight gain. This was in our first pilot study, so it's only 35 subjects. But Katie Demos found a very similar response in terms of elevated nuclear accumbens response to palatable food images predicting weight gain. In her study, she had 48 subjects. Giha, which is a much smaller study with only 15 subjects, found a lot of evidence of activation, reward, and kind of other gustatory regions in response to taste of palatable food predicting future weight gain, but nobody's ever been able to replicate that, so I wouldn't file that way too deeply in your memory. In another study we did, we took an episode of Mythbusters and inserted unhealthy food commercials and then alternative commercials that weren't food commercials, and found that the kids who showed the greatest striatal response to high-calorie food commercials, like for Applebee's, which I don't understand why they found that appetizing, but it predicted future weight gain in this study as well. And now getting into the studies where we just try to recruit healthy weight kids at baseline so that we make sure that we don't, that there's no history of overeating that might have affected neural circuitry, we found greater OFC, again, that was the same region we found in that first study, to cues that predict impending milkshake taste, predicted initial excess body weight gain over 3-year follow-up. This was 162 kids in this sample, so a pretty robust finding, or robust sample size. And we were able to, at the recommendation of our reviewers, conduct split half replication so that OFC effect emerged in both split halves of the sample. And if anybody here has ever tried split half replication with brain imaging data, it's a very, very high bar. So anyway, it seems like a pretty robust finding. And this, again, was not driven by a potential history of overeating. So in sum, elevated reward region response to cues associated with reward from high-calorie foods predicts future weight gain, and it suggests that people with a propensity to learn cues that predict future food reward may be at greatest risk for obesity. So the question is, not only are there individual differences in no response to the experience of eating these palatable foods, but are there individual differences in how quickly people learn reward predictive cues? So we tested those questions, which I won't repeat again, and then tested whether that predicts future weight gain. This was, remember I talked about the Schultz findings, where you see basically initially you see the greatest dopamine signaling in response to taste of palatable foods, and then that decreases as people kind of experience more and more taste of the foods, but the reward region response to cues that predict that taste go up. And you can see that very nice separation here, and that the red region is showing that increasing responsivity to reward predictive cues, and the blue line, which is not a linear line, I'm the first to admit, goes down as you habituate and get used to the food, and you show less and less reward region response. So critically, the people who were the best reward cue learners in terms of encoding in the ventral pallidum and some other brain regions, reward regions, show much greater weight gain over time. In fact, even the people who show the greater habituation, so the people who really get sensory specific satiety quickly from eating the same candy, they gain the most weight too. And I'm not entirely sure how to interpret that yet, but that's a pretty large effect size. So to kind of sum up the predictive effects in context, the reward cue learning propensity and reward habituation show very large effects. The reward region responsivity average across the trials that I talked about is an average R.37, which is fairly large. For those of you who had human physiology, you recognize some of these variables, but resting metabolic rate, everybody's always like, oh, you must have a very slow metabolism or whatever. Resting metabolic rate has a very, very weak predictive effect for weight gain. It was a non-significant correlation of 0.15. So there is some support for it. There's also the energy balance model, which I'm sure everybody here totally believes that's sacrosanct, that that's the first law of thermodynamics, that you can't destroy or create energy. So the only way to get fat is if you swallow more calories than you burn. Well, it turns out you can use doubly labeled water to measure very precisely how many calories you've eaten and how many calories you've expended in a 2-week period of time. And if you subtract those two numbers, it doesn't predict weight gain like it's supposed to predict weight gain. So it's good that we have these predictive effects. It's curious why energy balance doesn't really matter as much as everybody acts like it. If you present these findings to people at the Nutrition Society, and they will have none of it. It's like, no, it's all first law of thermodynamics. It's like, well, if you tested it, it would be useful to test this, but we've never been able to find that predicts weight gain in several samples now. Anyway, parental obesity shows a pretty weak effect, and you think of parental obesity as the main driver. I mean, I've had clients that say, oh, it doesn't really matter what I eat and how much I exercise. My parents are overweight. It's all biology. It's like, that's not helpful. Try eating healthy and try exercising. And smoking cessation is actually a much better predictor than some of these other factors, but I'm getting off topic here. So these emerging effects from the prospective studies do line up with the reward surfeit model. And we're interested in some genetic work, because dopamine is supposed to play a very profound role in kind of reward learning, and has been implicated in a lot of addictive behaviors, including obesity. The one thing that we had found, though, is that individual SNPs don't show really reliable effects. So we thought, well, why don't we take a whole bunch of SNPs that have been implicated in reward signaling capacity or dopamine signaling capacity and put them together like a multi-item scale. Like when we measure depression, we use a multi-item scale to capture the facets of the construct. Maybe we can increase our reliability by using SNPs and creating a multi-locus score. So what we did is essentially went into 3 different samples, and we had genotyped people. I'm so used to having my computer in front of me, so if you give me a test of what SNPs are in here, I might not pass it, but I think it was a TEC1 allele, the DRD2, 141 insertion delete, the DRD4, the COMT, and the DAT1. Anyway, if you put those all together, they predict future weight gain in 3 independent samples, and if you guys have done genetic research, you probably know that having predictive effects of a genetic effect in 3 separate samples is very challenging. Even more exciting, and we totally forgot about this when we first published this, is that it predicts response to a behavioral weight loss intervention. And this is sort of an embarrassing study because it was our first obesity treatment trial. We did it, we analyzed the pre to post effects, and there was not any sign of effect. And I was like, oh shit, that was a waste of a year, and I think it was like $50,000 that we had to spend for this trial. And so I put that data aside, but reviewers were like, oh, does your multi-locus score moderate the effects of treatment? So we circled back around and sort of looked at this, and basically what happens is if you have a high genetic capacity or propensity for greater dopamine signaling, when you go through that intervention, you lose weight, but then it all comes back on by 2-year follow-up, and this is a 6-month weight loss intervention, standard negative energy balance diet. But if you have a genetic propensity for low dopamine signaling, you lose weight and you keep losing weight. Like you get more weight loss after we finish that study, that's the black bars there, than you do during the first 6 months of the study. So that was pretty encouraging. And you know, in the control condition, if you have that genetic propensity for greater signaling, you gain weight, which is essentially what you saw in those other 3 panels. So it's sort of an encouraging example of precision medicine that we might be able to genotype people on these SNPs to see who could respond to this particular intervention and give the intervention to them and then try something else with the other people, although I'm not really sure what we try for them. So I also want to talk about repeated measures designs. Animal experiments have shown that regular intake of high-calorie foods results in downregulation of dopamine receptors, D2 receptors, reductions in reward region response to a whole bunch of different things that I won't bore you with, but this is really robust findings, very, very powerful. And you see greater behavioral responsivity to reward predictive effects. Nobody's ever done any of these studies using brain imaging with humans, but we thought it would be valuable. So we wanted to do a couple of repeated measure studies to try to capture some of this neuroplasticity, because if you're showing increases in responsivity of reward circuitry to food predictive cues, that might, you know, basically take a risk factor and make it more powerful as people kind of start a period of overeating. We thought it was important to capture these phenomena. So we did a couple of different repeated measure studies. The first one was the other side of that, which is, you know, what I was saying, that when a rat first tastes an M&M, you get great dopamine signaling, but then after they've eaten a couple, they get less and less activation. That's precisely what we found when we just looked at caudate response to taste of chocolate milkshake, that basically we took people and arrayed them into those who lost weight, stayed weight stable, or gained weight, and the people who gained a whole bunch of weight showed this dramatic decrease in how much your reward circuitry is activated by tasting the same chocolate milkshake 6 months later. So this was very powerful evidence of this reward deficit, that you can induce it by a period of overeating really energy-dense foods. Aliso did this really fantastic study where they basically took animals and injected high-calorie food directly into their gut, so it's not even going through your oral cavity, and compared that to isocaloric intake of rat chow, which is apparently very healthy. And basically what they find is if you have a period of eating really high energy dense foods, it reduces you know, dopamine signaling, D2 receptor density, and all this stuff. So it's really not that a calorie is a calorie, but these really energy dense calories seem to affect your brain in a unique way. Some other repeated measures designs, which are just randomized experiments, but Teller has found that mice in which reduced striatal response was induced through chronic fat infusion, they would work less for food and eat less food ad lib. So this reward deficit doesn't seem to result in greater caloric intake, it actually results in less caloric intake. So that was very, very valuable to learn. Hardman also did a really nice dopamine depletion study with amino acid precursors and found that if you basically deplete dopamine availability, people don't eat hardly at all. So this reward deficit idea that Nora Volkoff and Jean-Jacques Wang have really pushed a lot it's a consequence of overeating. It's not a precursor, and even if you induce a reward deficit, it doesn't cause you to eat more, it causes you to eat less. So it's good to know that. But on the other side of the coin, we did this other study, which was capturing that increased incentive value of reward predictive cues. And we found that adolescents who gained weight over a 3-year period of time showed an increase in striatal response to cues that predict palatable foods versus adolescents who may remain weight stable. So this is essentially repeated measures design, capturing the very concept that Kent Berry just talked about in his incentive sensitization model. And this is the same thing that happens with drugs of abuse. So probably very, very similar thing would go on with cocaine or something else like that. Okay, so in some of these risk factor studies, elevated reward region response to food cues predicts future weight gain. Overeating increases this vulnerability. So you're born with this vulnerability factor. When it begins to express itself, it actually makes that vulnerability factor more potent. And so this is consistent with the incentive sensitization model and the dynamic vulnerability model that sort of weaves those together. But there's little evidence, or pretty much no prospective support, that low reward region responsivity to food predicts future weight gain. It seems to just be a consequence of overeating. So it's really, I mean, we wouldn't have, if we just did cross-sectional studies, we wouldn't have been able to figure any of this stuff out. So I think it's really valuable to do these types of prospective and kind of repeated measures type studies. But the implication of this work is that interventions that reduce reward region response to food cues, whether endogenous or induced, may reduce overeating. And we've gone through and looked at cognitive reappraisal training, food response training, blockade of sweet taste receptors, and even dissonance induction interventions, as all 4 of those interventions can reduce valuation of particular stimuli. Today I was just going to talk about the food response training because it's sort of an interesting, thought-provoking set of findings. But anyway, we think all these lines of research are important. So in food response training, there's people use go, no go, and stop signal training. And basically, if you're sitting down at a computer, up pops a picture of grapes, and there's a go signal, which is a black box surrounding it. So you hit the space bar. When the cookies show up, there's a no-go response, which is just a dotted line. So you're just basically cueing people to make a behavioral response or cueing them to withhold a behavioral response. The same thing happens in the stop signal paradigm, but the response cue is just delayed slightly, just to annoy you, I think. So anyway, that's Harm-Vailing and Natalia Lawrence both did studies looking at these, at go, no-go, and stop signal paradigms respectively, and found some evidence of weight loss. They weren't gigantic effects, but this is just with people playing video games for, I want to say it was like 40 minutes in these early studies, so very, very brief period of exposure. We also came across some attention bias modification, attention modification therapy that Kemp's has done, Efficacy over in Australia, and then response cue training that Tom Schoenberg's done. But basically, in the dot probe paradigm, 2 foods appear on the screen, and you're supposed to respond to where the dot appears. If you make the dot appear behind a healthy food, you basically train people to direct their attention to the healthy foods and away from the unhealthy foods. She and I have had long debates about this. I actually think this is response training in another guise, but it's an empirical question where we don't have a clear answer to it. But if you take an attention training paradigm and remove the behavioral response, it doesn't produce any change in valuation of the food. So I think it's basically another form of response training. But it sounds better if you say you're training responses in inhibition as well as attention, because if you can make it easier for people to avoid tempting foods, it'll help them eat a healthier diet. So that's the whole idea, is to train use behavioral response training to train inhibitory response every time they see high-calorie foods and approach response when they see healthy foods, and to train attention away from unhealthy foods and towards healthy foods. So is that clear? So an interesting question is, what is the mechanism of this effect? And this was, I sort of reached out to Harm-Vailing, Natalia Lawrence, and Eva Kemp and said, hey, you guys want to collaborate? I think what you guys are doing is all the same thing, and we should weave it together in an intervention. But they all had their own different explanatory story. Harm-Vailing said, oh, it just changes valuation. So you can reduce the valuation of these high-calorie foods, and that's why people don't like to eat the foods and they eat less of it. So it does reduce palatability ratings and monitor evaluation of the training foods. So that there's some support for that. But Eva Kemps and her team in Australia said, oh no, it's all attentional bias. And she has found all sorts of support for attentional bias, change in dot probe tasks. This is a little bit of a conundrum there, because if you measure it using the dot probe task, you're undoing your training, which sounds like a really petty thing to worry about. But if you basically use an unbalanced dot probe modification to train attention away, if you use a balanced one where it's a 50-50 one, you're training the attention back towards that stimuli. So there's some inherent challenges in interpreting that finding, but anyway. And then third, there is a question of, is it inhibitory control training? Are you basically training people to have an inhibitory response whenever they see tempting foods? There is some evidence to support that in terms of the reaction time reduces and the error rates reduce in response to the high-calorie foods the more they do the training. So there's some evidence for all three of those. But we thought we could try to test the intervention mechanism of effect, as well as to compare how, if you weave all 5 of these things together, well, 4 if you're counting correctly, if it works better. So we took and created this kind of multifaceted response training with a go-no-go stop signal, the response signal, which is exactly like the stop signal but reversed, a dot probe task, which I talked about, and then we just sort of randomly said, well, let's do a visual search, because imagine if you see a huge array of unhealthy foods and your job is to quickly touch the one healthy food, it's going to really improve your ability to direct your attention to the healthy food. We thought there would be value in kind of putting these two things together, so we did. We randomized 47 obese adults to food response training versus generic response training, and this is the exact same training, just without food images. So when you're comparing these results, please interpret this as a very credible alternative intervention, because our control subjects are like, oh, this response training is working really well. I'm eating much healthier. I was like, well, you're in the control condition, but okay. So it's very credible. In this study, we did a 4-hour training block, 1 hour every week for 4 weeks. We also personalized the food images, because if you think about it, if you don't like a particular high-calorie food, like, don't waste any time training yourself to not like it or to respond to it. Only focus on the things that you eat. So we used personalized selected food images. Compliance was very high. I did not have any confidence that people would do all these trainings that we asked, but we have very nice research staff and they established a good rapport. So they did it. But what was sort of interesting is that the participants actually thought it was kind of cool, because they, when I was talking to them ahead of time, having them basically play a video game for a couple hours versus not eating their ice cream that they really like to eat, they'd way rather play the video game. So it surprised me that they would be so excited about doing response training. In terms of the outcomes, we saw a nice reduction in the palatability ratings of the high-calorie foods, and it reduced more in response training versus control participants. We saw a very nice reduction in monetary evaluation, like how much you're willing to pay for the different types of high-calorie foods. So both of those behavioral data suggest changes in valuation, not inhibitory control or attention. Critically, the intervention versus control participants showed greater reductions in responsivity to reward and attention regions to high-calorie foods versus low-calorie foods. And this is, as much as I just said, sometimes I don't believe fMRI findings, I thought this is a really cool way of testing the different mediators, because you can do whole brain analyses with fMRI, and you are positioned to detect changes in inhibitory regions and attention regions, reward regions, all sorts of different regions that would be activated in terms of the 3 different mechanisms that I talked about, the mediators. So it was a kind of a good way of blankly, at the same time, testing what is a mechanism of effect. But we saw reductions in attention, reward, and then sensory processing. The Rolanda capriculum is a gustatory kind of processing region, just in response to images of high-calorie versus low-calorie foods. So it seemed to tell a pretty consistent story. Here's the attainment effect in the middle and the mid-insula effect on the right. But the response training participants showed a nice reduction. And again, this is an objective biological outcome. It's not like they can sort of say, hey, I'm going to make more blood flow to my insula. The expectancies or demand characteristics shouldn't be affecting these outcomes. And in terms of behavioral data, which is brain imaging talk for does your self-report measure line up with your brain imaging data, We saw the reductions in the post-central gyrus and in mid-insula correlated with reductions in palatability ratings of the high-calorie foods, and the reductions in putamen and mid-insula response correlated with reductions in monetary evaluation of the high-calorie foods, that willingness to pay. So that was reassuring. Intervention versus control participants showed a greater reduction in body fat. We used the BOD-POD, which is an air displacement approach to measuring body composition. We did not get effects for BMI, and for all those people in the room that think BMI is as good as like body composition, this is the third study where we find good signal when we measure body fat and don't find good signal when we look at body mass index. But that's because body mass index doesn't differentiate fat mass from muscle mass, which is kind of germane to obesity treatment. The body fat loss effects did not reach significance by 6-month follow-up, so it suggests that ongoing training is important. But as a proof of concept, having people do 4 hours of training to affect kind of neural response to food cues is good. And the reductions in body fat correlate with changes in palatability ratings of the high-calorie foods and the low-calorie foods, again, providing just a bit more confidence in those findings.
Just quick clarification, the images that they saw in the fMRI task were different foods than the ones they had been trained on?
We did half and half, because we wanted to have a little bit of evidence of external validity, because it's a huge issue about does training generalize to things outside the images used in the training. But if you think about it, if we're seeing body fat reductions, they obviously have to be eating a different diet. So I'm less concerned about it because we have that outcome, but we did try to we didn't include enough images of the novel high-calorie foods to do the analyses separately, so it's sort of a commingling of the two. But very good question. So the response and attention training seems to be appealing because it represents an implicit training intervention for obesity that reduces valuation of these high-calorie foods and attention to them. So it basically makes it easier for you to eat a healthier diet. It doesn't require the top-down inhibitory controlled dietary intake, which is very effortful and people report as unpleasant. It doesn't result in compensatory responses theoretically. It shouldn't affect your RMR or storage of fat intake. So theoretically, it might work a little bit better in the long run. We'll see. So in conclusion, elevated reward region response to food cues predicts future weight gain. Regular intake of high-calorie foods increases this neural vulnerability factor, further increasing overeating. And emerging research is identifying several ways to reduce valuation of these food cues that may be more effective in preventing and treating obesity than the current approaches, negative energy balance diets. In terms of future directions, I only have this and one more slide. We're, along with Harm-Bailey, Natalia Lawrence, and Eva Kemps, and Sonia Yoko, my collaborator, and I, we're doing an N of 160 response training intervention. We just did the analyses for our data safety and monitoring board that I got like 2 days ago. And the effect sizes are looking like they're resonating with what we got in the pilot. Again, we find effects with body fat, but not with BMI. But in this study, so hopefully it'll work out, but the data are really, we just do the interim analyses for the data safety and monitoring board to make sure we're not doing any iatrogenic, producing iatrogenic effects. But we decided to make the training more game-like. And what was really interesting to me is, initially, there's a way of doing these computer paradigms where you make them adaptive, or they use a laddering procedure, so it makes it harder and harder to get it right. It was like, why would we want to make this so people are making more errors? Because you would think theoretically the training would be less effective. Well, it turns out that making the paradigms more difficult to get right makes the effects work bigger, or that makes the effects bigger. And it's probably because people are really fully engaging and devoting their attention to it. So instead of doing this while they're checking their cell phone, they have to devote all their attention to it. So, there's these little things that I think we're going to be able to kind of create bigger and bigger effects as we learn these little variables. We're also adding booster sessions to have people just do this training for 10 minutes every week for a whole 1-year follow-up. I'm not sure if they'll listen to us, but we're going to encourage it. So we'll be able to tell you how that works in a couple of years. And then,
of engagement were you trying to improve? I thought you said people kind of like doing it.
Just having them do it 10 minutes at home for the rest of their life is essentially what we're encouraging them to do. So we thought we'd better pay attention to the engagement part of it. But I don't know, the gamification and stuff, I think there's a lot of a lot of concern that the cognitive science field that like, no, don't make it too much like a game. You'll destroy all the effects, and all the people who want people to do the training a whole bunch want improved engagement. So I'm not sure where it'll go. We did small gamifications of like giving them feedback on how many points, how quickly they did this paradigm so they can try to improve it. But people like mastery. I mean, Beth and I were talking about that, but mastery and engagement, dose response, like all that stuff matters. So we'll see. Hopefully it'll work. With Elliot Berkman, who's a collaborator at the University of Oregon, we're doing a very similar trial, but we're focusing on high carcinogenic foods like red meats and burnt toast, which who knew burnt toast was like the highest carcinogenic food? But anyway, we're comparing that to cognitive reappraisal, which I didn't talk about today, but that's where you basically, as you view tempting foods, so if you're at Starbucks looking at all the pastries and stuff like that, instead of saying, which one sounds the best today, which is what most of us would do, if you say, oh, if I eat that, it'll clog up my arteries or increase my likelihood of a stroke, it reduces reward region response and increases inhibitory control. So it's another way of doing the same, producing the same changes as response and attention training. And all these are computer-delivered training. So we'll, in a couple of years, we'll either know definitively that there's a horrible idea or that maybe it's a good idea. So, and now I want to thank my collaborators and field any questions. Well,
I'm curious, nice talk. Curious in terms of reducing bulimic symptoms. Are you powered enough to actually? Yeah, are you powered enough to actually show whether you can prevent people from developing, a severe, illness like bulimia nervosa, which is, a bit different than just bulimic symptoms?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. In these trials, we probably won't because we excluded people with a full threshold eating disorder at baseline. So unfortunately, to get a nice homogeneous sample in your fMRI studies, you get these squeaky clean samples without eating disorders if you're studying obesity. So we don't know, but we are doing a big trial it's a dissonance-based version of the Body Project. It's a treatment for eating disorders, and that's what I spoke about when I visited. And we are doing paradigms where we look at kind of reward and attention region response to, thin supermodels and binge foods. So at least we'll learn something a little bit about whether interventions that reduce that, if our hypotheses are confirmed, translates into eating disorders. But I have to say I'm really taken aback by the degree of support for the dual pathway model of eating disorders, and I'm not sure that this variable is in there. I mean, we have found recently that overeating does predict onset. It's either binge eating or bulimia nervosa. So we're starting to look a little bit more at a crossover between obesity and eating disorders, but I wouldn't put a lot of money on it because I really think the eating disorders are qualitatively different than just plain obesity. But it's just a guess. I would guess that you need more potent things to prevent more really serious eating disorders. But the other thing, and we've spoken about this, is the types of really severe cases that you guys see in your clinic we hardly ever find them when we do community research. So if we go out into middle schools and recruit people and follow them for 8 years, the types of eating disorders they exhibit don't look like the severe cases that we see at our most intense inpatient settings. So we may never really get an answer to that question because of that slippage, because I think those really severe cases drop out of school really early on and are missing the regular ways that we recruit people for these studies. But no, it's a really interesting question because Carrie Vitale has been very interested in that question of can you use response and attention training to kind of treat obesity or eating disorders. So far, I don't think there's any good data out there. She had a small uncontrolled trial, but it's a really interesting idea that I think would be worth pursuing, as well as doing response and attention training to supermodels. If you can make people like average-looking people as opposed to skinny supermodels, that may be equally as important. Yeah.
Another one. So in your talk last fall and in this one, you alluded to the idea that obese people are really desperate to not desire the high-density foods, right? Like they really...
Yeah, they would like less craving.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm wondering, given that all this is kind of computerized and automated and sort of ready to go, and your personal tendency to want to give stuff away, I wonder if you just put it online and have people do it, you could do kind of a natural experiment and get a really nice dose response curve based on how much they do this.
No, it's a great idea, and I haven't, but Natalia Lawrence, my collaborator in the UK, has, and she actually did. She just does a go no go task, and that's it. But it's pretty. I mean, I think it's just one version of the same idea. But she had a huge story in the Daily Mail, which I think is one of the tacky British. Anyway, I didn't say that out loud, right?
It's being recorded.
But she, hopefully not aired in Britain. But she had like something insane, like 60,000 people signed up and did her training because she put it up on the web and anybody could do it. And this was over like a couple-week period. So she got enormous response and a great deal of interest in it. And then she also has created an app so you can carry around your phone. And if you're feeling temptation, you can kind of play the game a little bit and kind of just assuage that craving right there. So I think it's a really good idea. The dose response thing is challenging though, because you have other factors that might explain why some people do it a little bit and some people do it a lot. And I'm not sure if you're not manipulating the dose, I'm not sure you get to make the inference that the dose is what's driving the differential effects, but it would be a piece of data that might line up with other data that would be compelling. But yeah, it's an interesting question. We haven't put it up for sale and given it away for free. And it's very selfish because when you're doing randomized trials, like our research group is maybe we're more neurotic, but we worry about our control subjects finding this crap on the internet and doing it. Like, when we have a internet-based version of the Body Project, we close that site down when we do trials so that our controls don't accidentally, read the informed consent thing and say, what's this Body Project thing? And like Google it, because it's very easy to find out stuff today. So. But yeah, hopefully we'll be able to kind of give it away for free and maybe it'll work with people. But I think that, Nilu and I were talking about this earlier, is I think this is a good part of a more multifaceted intervention that I think this alone probably is not going to be enough to really kind of cure obesity. But it's a good part of it that might make it a lot easier for people to, follow the recommendations after they go through bariatric surgery. Because, bariatric surgery often fails because people go back to eating like they used to eat instead of eating like they're suggested to eat. Well, I guess this is it.
Yes, you covered it. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, everybody.